Good morning / afternoon, evening, wherever you might be in the world. Today is Thursday, August 9th, 2018. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture Community Meeting. And I am your host, co-chair Jay Singer-Dumars. Your other chair is Brian Grant, who I believe may be joining us shortly. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and dig into the agenda, which is available for your perusal at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And that document, I will paste a link in the chat now for those folks who'd like to see what we're doing here. And I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my screen for real. Okay, can you all let me know? Anybody? Is that visible, everybody?
Yep.
Great, thanks, Jordan. All right, so what we're going to do is go through the agenda. So the first thing is just housekeeping, which is to quickly walk the boards, so to speak, of our project boards. So in kept tracking, basically, I have added a bunch of new keps to the backlog. And so if you are the owner of one of these keps or you are involved in one of these SIGs that are working on these, definitely feel free to let me know if the state needs to move over to in SIG review. I think actually this one here may need to move over, but essentially the states here is backlog means that somebody's generated a KEP. It's not been fully reviewed by the SIG, so it's basically in the ideation phase or initial documentation phase. And then as the SIG starts adding, deleting, changing, doing all that stuff to the KEP in progress, that will move over to the in SIG review column. And then after that, essentially we have this column that is for those the KEPs that have architectural implications and need to be reviewed by the SIG. And so we will put those there. This is also just for visibility where we add things that are in API review. So essentially this allows you to see the full backlog of things that we need to do for the SIGs for our architectural due diligence. Right now, we don't necessarily need to go through these, but if you have any updates on these, feel free to add those. Conformance tests. Aaron, how fortuitous that you have arrived, because it looks like this may be stuff that you've added. Do you want to talk about this?
Oh, that's so random. How did that happen? Yeah, so this week in Adventures in Conformance Testing, I've added a bunch of stuff to the in review column that I need SIG Architecture to look at. I'd like to have a broader conversation at some point as to how I can have more people than just Brian Grant and Clayton Coleman be the people who can apply the /approve label. Or I need to find like a designated time where I know I can get their attention and we can have a back and forth if we need to do that. What I've been doing lately is I identified that there are a number of tests in the E2E node directory which have the conformance tag applied to them. It doesn't make any sense. Like none of the tests in E2E node actually get run as part of the conformance suite. If you're used to running conformance tests with Sonoboy, for example, like they don't run. So what I'm doing instead is trying to get all of those tests ported over to test/E2E/common, which is a set of files that are compiled both into the E2E test binary, which runs conformance tests, as well as the E2E node binary, which runs node conformance tests. So we're trying to port all those things over. I'm basically trying to look at what are the things inside of E2E node that don't actually require running on the node itself, and don't assume that they have like write access to the host, because it's highly likely that there are a bunch of tests that can be ported over to E2E common and turned into conformance tests that way. Broadly speaking, I'm trying to focus mostly on tests that exercise pod behaviors, although I'm also in discussions about storage classage, storage profiles, and registry-related tests.
Yeah, I can speak to the point about getting more approvers. I think the main thing is we need to. Our microphone is muted.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear.
Sorry, there are multiple ways of muting. Yeah, and we need to get a group of people who's kind of trained to know what to look for. I think, Aaron, you're probably likely the first person we're going to add as you've been digging into this. I think you're building an understanding, and then we can ask questions and refine the criteria that are checked in. And once that's clear, then we can have a clear way of sort of onboarding. And the usual way we had intended to onboard people is to have them do some first pass reviews, and then if they're doing a good job on reviews, then promote them to be approvers. So I think that same process can work here. As far as getting my time, I'm trying to batch the reviews as much as possible so we can get them into the tracking board. Then I can sweep through and comment on like everything that's in one column or two columns. I don't know if we need all of these columns, maybe just have 3 columns or something like that. But you know, getting interrupted at various times during the week doesn't work super well for me. So I just want to sweep through them in a batch. But yeah, the pod tests, because we have so many different plugins at the node level, and because some people are trying to re-implement kubelet functionality as well, it's super important that we get pod level functionality into the conformance suite. It's one of the most critical things that pretty much everybody who uses Kubernetes has to use pods. And it's a large fraction of the surface area of Kubernetes is actually in the pod API as well. So that's why that's such a high priority. And there's just such a huge gap there because a lot of the testing was done not through end-to-end tests, but through other types of tests, which is reasonable. And that's an issue we need to address going forward, which is building test frameworks that can run tests in multiple modes. But at the moment, we don't have any magic that can do that. So thank you, Aaron, for starting to sweep through this. If there are things that need my attention, yeah, GitHub notifications are kind of useless. So continue to ping me through other channels and I'll see whether I can get them. But I plan to at least make sure I get through things that are accumulated at least once a week.
Yeah, I'll ping you offline. Like, I think what would be helpful from my perspective is to at least know when that batch is, so I can start setting that as the deadline for other people. So like I can review their stuff in time to get it handed over to you. I think the other thing that would help grow the pool of people who understand what conformance is if we kind of refine that document on conformance requirements. I showed it initially to this meeting as a work in progress, and then Tim St. Clair said, oh, cool, it's ready for review, even though I had it as a work in progress. So I think after chatting with him offline, I'm going to make a Google Doc and see if a bunch of us can make a more refined pass on that, because I really want to walk away with a doc that's a pretty clear to understand checklist for people who are writing tests and people who are reviewing tests to understand, like, does this make sense as conformance? Right.
Yep, sounds good.
All right, that's it for me.
Thanks, Aaron. That's great. Moving right along, the API reviews board. Right now there's one assigned. I added some more from the backlog, or to the backlog rather, from the main repo. So need to figure out a process for how to better scale this stuff, because I don't scale well, and I need to probably start training people on how to manage some of this stuff. So essentially what we're going to try and do is pair people, reviewers, to these if they're not already, and then
so Jace, I started on the storage snapshot, and I did a first pass on it, in fact, but I didn't think to even update this. Do you expect the individual reviewers to come and update the board, or do we use this meeting as a rally point for some smaller group to update the board?
Yeah, I figured that this meeting, the best thing we could do is just move the cards so people can see that the things happen as they are done. So if you've got this under review, then I'd move that into underway so people know that it's...
Yeah, so there was a separate question that I asked, but I don't think I got an answer to. I apologize. I just got back from vacation, so I've got hundreds of emails to dig through.
Of course.
The answer may be in my inbox. So part of the storage history was that I was sort of deeply involved with the storage SIG, and so I was part of the snapshot overall design. I can do their API review. Do we think it's appropriate for me to be involved in both roles, or do we want a secondary review of just the API from somebody who's less familiar with
my inclination is to have the person with the most subject matter expertise review it. And as somebody who's a discriminating reviewer as yourself, you've reviewed enough things that you probably know if you're too close to it, in a sense that you can't be impartial. So pretty much with the review team, my hope is that they will recuse themselves where it's appropriate, and so that's pretty much the decision of the reviewer. But
I think, for day-to-day reviews, I think that totally makes sense and is totally appropriate. As someone who's been brought in on things with no context, it is pretty hard. Although one thing I've noticed in the past with storage in particular is it doesn't follow a lot of the same guidelines and patterns and conventions as other parts of the system, or may not be aware of decisions that were made in other parts of the system. So definitely we need to document those more, but it may also help to, not for every review, but maybe periodically sync up and take a step back and look at how things are diverging, and try to come up with some sort of consensus about which practices we think are good, or which ones we think we want to change going forward,
reasonable.
Or just share knowledge like, oh, yeah, this is how we do that thing.
It seems reasonable. My thinking in asking the question was mostly around having someone to challenge. Since I know the design of it, I have sort of built-in assumptions and biases towards it. And it's been very useful in the past to get people who are less familiar to look at a design and say, well, why did you have to do it that way? Isn't there this other option that you didn't explore? Could you do that? So I think for big reviews, that's useful. This one I think is on the edge of that. Definitely there's going to be a lot of reviews that are smaller than won't need that.
So the review process, once it's merged, essentially does call out that a reviewer can pull in other reviewers as they see fit, to vet assumptions or to have a discussion around some things, because I believe that a lot of these things are really discussion points because they're going to drive the future of how the APIs are implemented. So I would see that reserving time specifically in the SIG architecture meeting, if there's a discussion on it, would make sense. And so maybe that's a good way to handle those, where you're like, well, I feel good about this, but I would love for a second set of eyes or a group of eyes to look at this and get a feel for if it looks good.
Okay.
So. Yeah, I think it's going to be really critical to scale out the pool of reviewers in order to make this feasible in general.
Yep, 100%.
I also feel like, though, a little bit right now we're at a turning point where we're telling a lot of people not to build in resources and to use CRD, but CRD has some known limitations. I've got another one that's in the queue. I don't know when they're coming up for this, but it's not one of mine, but it came through me and I said that you should use CRD, and there's some pushback because of the limitations of CRD. Yep. And so some people are experiencing some pain, and I feel bad about that, but maybe not bad enough to change our direction.
Yeah, there's a lot of pain. This will come up in the Runtime Class review as well. Momentarily, we're in a situation, the typical situation of, the old way is deprecated, but the new way is not ready yet. CRD is one thing along those lines, but adding fields to existing stable APIs is another thing along those lines, where we said don't use annotations, but don't add fields either. So we'll need to figure out how to address that.
You do allow exceptions though, right? Or adding fields.
And so far we've caved on pretty much every one, but we need to stop caving. So, and another general topic is we really need to stabilize Kubernetes. We don't have enough people actually working on that. We continue to add features at a shocking rate. So somehow we need to turn the tide on that eventually. So we had, just moving forward in the agenda, we had a bunch of things added, and the main topic is the runtime class review. Almost certainly we won't get through all the issues, but I would like at least a half an hour for that. Maybe we should just do the short items first and call time at 11:30. I can't see who is on the call. Matt Farina, are you on?
I am.
Okay. So you had a question about the release versioning. Can you briefly explain that? Because I didn't have time to click through the link.
Sure. So Go modules are coming, right? And Go modules require your Go API to strictly follow semantic versioning, which is something we just don't do. You can look at things like API server, which doesn't follow the semantic versioning tag string format. For example, they do Kubernetes dash and then the version. And so that doesn't follow it. And then there's other things like Kubernetes, which while are minor releases, we break the Go API every time and people import that. And so this is not going to work with Go modules. And so I'm curious how we make this work since they're coming.
I have two things to say in response to that. First of all, the client Go does follow semantic versioning, and we rev the major version every time, and people hate that. And the other response is those other libraries you mentioned are, I would say, explicitly in the V0 stage, where we're not, we haven't yet gotten to the 1.0 thing where we would follow semantic versioning. Like, right, even if people are importing them, we're not making guarantees at this point. That said, I agree that we need a strategy to handle Go's module system, and I believe I even filed an issue about it like several months ago. And
so I have a question, which is where do these version numbers show up? Is it on tags or?
The major version number becomes part of the package name effectively. So when you break compatibility, people have to change their import statements.
I see.
Yeah, so there's two things. If you're on V0 or V1, major versions in Semver, it's still the normal path. Once you go to V2 and V3, then your path changes for the imports. And then it also uses though tags from your version control system, which is where for something like Kubernetes, we say it's a V0. Our tags correlated to our Go APIs, correlated to consumer speak something different than what Go modules expect.
I mean,
so we may have one intent, but the intent is different for, yeah.
From Go's perspective, you can tell it's V0 because we don't have a version number in the path, right, in the import path. There's no version number.
V0 and V1, there is no version number in the import path for either one of those.
Version 0, but in version 1, like even if Kubernetes is version whatever, that doesn't mean our Go libraries are at that version.
I think, doesn't this go back to the conversation we had maybe a month ago about going through the repository, finding out things that we want to vendor, things that we want to push server side, and kind of coming up with a plan for like making things more renderable? And then if we solve that problem, perhaps we could get semantic versioning to work for those portions of the API that we actually want to vendor out.
I think we could make the staging directory a lot more natural if we switch to using Go modules, because there's very convenient override directives.
Okay, Matt.
So I was just going to say, I mean, there's a real world practical problem. And then we talked about here, there's a whole bunch of people who import Kubernetes, and their stuff is not something in the staging repo. So on the current path, once we have Go modules in place and people need to use Go modules, then they won't be able to import Kubernetes and be able to deal with Go API changes the way we've been doing them in Kubernetes. So if we don't change, then in some way, shape, or form, then people who consume Kubernetes today will not be able to do that sufficiently in the future, and it's going to create problems.
The new Go system actually lets you publish multiple modules from the same repository, and I assume that we would use that.
Oh yeah, whatever we do.
Repos.
Well, but the thing is, right now we're publishing them to separate repos because you have to do that in order to let people import it separately. Under the new system, we could describe multiple modules in a single repo, and people would no longer be mandatory. You might still choose to do it, but it wouldn't be mandatory.
I see. So I actually want to pop up a level since we don't have a lot of time, which is we've been talking about sub-projects for SIG Architecture. I actually worked on that a little bit. One of the sub-projects I think we need is code organization. How do we deal with repos, staging, vendoring, Go modules, I guess, yet another new thing. So I think we need to actually have that as a discrete sub-project of SIG Architecture and have a set of people who are actually working on that and thinking about it and analyzing, well, how big of an impact across the project is this going to be? Are we going to actually be able to do that in a timely manner and interact with the other stakeholders and drive that forward? Especially with the changes to vendoring coming up and Go modules and whatever, we're going to need a more concerted effort on this, and we haven't made a lot of progress on things like feature branches either. we really need to get to a state where the Kubernetes master is kept in a releasable state, and we don't have any means of doing that. So, so we have a lot of challenges in this area, but not a very coordinated effort to address them.
Yep. Matt, I kind of feel like in general, you've been the one to raise a lot of these concerns. Do you think you would be able to bring resources to bear to help us solve these challenges?
Probably not until after October. Would be the soonest that I could probably put much time into it. Not until after October. Then I could take a look at what I could do. I
find you often represent folks who are downstream and who are impacted by this sort of thing. Do you think they might be willing to chip in some effort here?
I can go ask some folks.
Okay.
I think a challenge with this is that it's difficult to do drive-by contribution on this. Like it really needs to be focused and holistic if you want to actually make it better. So it's going to be challenging to find somebody like off the street to come and fix this for us.
Right. I think you also need somebody who's got an in-depth knowledge of the Kubernetes code base and the problems surrounding restructuring it. It can't be somebody, I vendor it. Well, this is the way I think we should do it.
Or someone who's willing to dig in and learn that, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
Like this is actually a tractable software engineering problem that, you know, there are some specific issues with the Kubernetes code base that are different than other code bases, but pretty much if you move things around and try to build it, it will break. So like you can get feedback from the system and not just rely on humans to figure it out.
We also need, I think, as a group to make a decision finally, eventually, as to how we feel about people vendoring Kubernetes or portions thereof, or whether we want to take a stronger position. We've sort of danced around the topic before, but maybe the position should be you don't vendor Kubernetes, you vendor something from staging.
I think that would be informed a lot by someone actually just digging in and doing the analysis.
Right? I'm saying we actually need to make a decision on that sooner rather than later.
But I'm saying data could inform the decision.
We need a concrete owner.
I think another input into that decision is how technically challenging it is to offer something with all the generated files.
Did they get quiet to anybody else?
Yep. Sorry.
All right, I moved away from the microphone. I think an input to the decision Tim just mentioned is how technically difficult is it post-Go modules to provide things that are
I'm still having trouble. Anybody else?
Can you hear us?
I can hear. Yeah, I can hear everyone just fine.
Should I repeat myself again? I don't know if it's worth three.
Yeah, that's a lot better. That's better.
Oh, okay. One thing we should figure out before we make a decision about whether people should be vendoring Kubernetes is how difficult is it to offer like 2 tracks of vendoring. Like if it's not difficult at all, then we should just say, no, don't vendor Kubernetes. We're going to make that easy for developers. And if it is incredibly difficult to offer multiple tracks, then maybe we can't stop checking in generated files or something like that.
So to summarize, we should figure out what the desired end state is before we start moving things around.
Well, I think we have the meta problem, which is we actually need a group of people working on it, right? Like I agree that drive-by contribution is going to be hard. We need people who are actually committed to working on it to chase things down.
There's an opportunity for an owner here to have actual decision-making authority.
So
we don't have
along those lines, we're going to get our kind of internal project job board is being spun up right now, contributor board, that we can post this as we are looking for people to own this. So anyway, we need to move on. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left for the other 2 issues on the agenda. But we can go ahead with that. Annotations to object fields.
I don't see the agenda, so whose topic was that?
That's Jan. I think he's on the line.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, there he is. Yes, Jan. Are you muted, Jan?
Jan, I'm worried that we don't have enough time to give this topic due consideration.
Well, I have a quick answer.
Okay, let's hear the quick answer.
The quick answer is no. There's no good way of doing it. Don't do it.
Well, we in storage got into a situation where we used annotation for some temporary stuff we eventually wanted to move somewhere else, but in the meantime, the annotations were declared as API. And unfortunately, we didn't use any alpha or beta or whatever prefix. So it looks like a stable annotation.
Right. So can you?
So I'm looking.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask you to start an email thread on Kubernetes SIG Architecture for each one of the separate email threads for each one of these 2 items. And we can just follow up.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Jan, I mean, given our discussion this morning, I think it's bigger than, this morning for me, it's bigger than what we can fit in this little time slot. And I would like to have the real conversation by email while we get everybody warmed up and then have the final fight.
Well, I also want to copy SIG API machinery on at least the annotation issue.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's more to it too, right? There's opportunities to start to embrace other patterns, and that's the stuff that I think needs real consideration. Like decorator CRDs and those sorts of things that some people are starting to explore already, but we haven't really formalized anything.
Okay, I will start emails then.
It's not clear to me that, well, I didn't look at this one, but so anyway, I want to move on to Runtime Class.
Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep. Yeah, so I'll just run through the KEP at a high level, just to kind of give everyone context on this, and then we can dive into the discussion. So this is a proposal for a new resource type called Runtime Class, and a field on the pod spec, which is a reference to the Runtime Class resource. The Runtime Class is defining different runtimes in the cluster, so different ways of actually running a container. And the primary motivating use case for this is to support multiple runtimes in the cluster. This is kind of bubbling up to the surface now with Kata containers and gvisor for implementing sandboxes. So this is, rather than using runc to do a native Linux container implementation, using nested virtualization or gvisor's emulated user space kernel approach to actually run the containers. And then kind of looking more like future looking, we also anticipate Windows runtimes coming down the pike, potentially runtimes for kind of legacy VM type workloads, and some of the serverless stuff that's being talked about as well.
So is there an idea, I took a quick look at the KEP, is there going to be any kind of way to indicate what subparts of pod will or will not work with different runtime classes? Is that part of the runtime class interface, or it's just going to be documentation?
So that was part of our kind of like original concept, but it got cut from the initial alpha proposal. So if we look at under the non-goals, I have a list of things that we'd eventually like to tackle or at least consider, but aren't included in the initial proposal. And the first one of those is surfacing support for optional features. And that's exactly what you're just saying, is defining which features can actually be used with this runtime, with this node. Yeah. And that's kind of going towards the second goal, high-level goal of this, which is to provide a place for surfacing runtime, container runtime properties to the control plane when it matters. And so surfacing the optional features is one. Pod overhead is another piece that we've discussed. So different runtimes require different amounts of memory for the various underlying infrastructure pieces. And so Runtime Class would provide a way for specifying that. We've talked about integrating it with scheduling. So if you're running a heterogeneous cluster, knowing where the pod can actually be run based on its desired runtime class. And then there's a few other things that we've kind of talked about as potential future extensions.
So you mentioned Windows. Do we expect that the way Windows support will work is that it will be explicit, or will it be sort of magical that you submit a Windows job and it figures out that you want the Windows version or Windows nodes?
I think it's going to need to be explicit because there's going to need to be features that you will want to request for Windows containers that you can't use for Linux containers, and vice versa. So, on our Linux containers, we have fields in the pod spec for things like AppArmor and SecComp and capabilities that don't make sense for Windows containers.
They don't even make sense for all Linux OS.
Yeah.
Right. So that's exactly what I was thinking about in terms of are we going to have a way of knowing which features of pods work and don't work?
One thing that has come up a few times in SIG Node is whether the operating system, like Linux versus Windows, is going to end up being a top-level field in the container spec, or if we can rely on Runtime Class for that. Whether or not it's a top-level field in the API spec, I think it still makes sense to pair that with Runtime Class as well, because there might be different options for, say, running a Windows container.
None of that helps with the backwards mistake of having put a bunch of Linux isms into the API.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, some year there will be a pod v2.
I think that's the kind of thing I'm trying to have. So you'd want an overall runtime config at a pod level to pass in the configurations for the pod in and of itself. Then there may be other configuration parameters for individual containers that are also operating system specific. So is that addressed inside of the container spec as well?
So if I understand correctly, you're saying like if you want to run a pod that has both a Linux and a Windows container in it?
We're assuming, let's not deal with that one. that doesn't happen. So like at a pod level, you have the runtime configuration that specifies whatever parameters you want for that container runtime at a pod level, right?
Yeah.
But there could be subcategories of configuration parameters that apply to particular containers that are also runtime specific.
So the runtime class is just, it's selecting the runtime that will be used to run the pod. It's not actually configuring that runtime. So there's kind of two different types of configuration. There's the static configuration, which is, we're saying that is explicitly out of scope for runtime class. This isn't runtime component config. And we're just assuming for now that that's statically configured on the node through whatever config file. And then there's the kind of the dynamic per pod configuration, which is all the stuff that's in the container in the pod spec, like the features we just mentioned.
So do we have a method to deal with that as well? Like, I could imagine if for gvisor, for instance.
The short answer is no, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Annotations is the only thing we have for that at the moment, which is
that's not,
pod level.
Yeah, it's not too bad. It's not too good either. Yeah.
I'm having a little trouble understanding kind of the distinction between a runtime class that indicates a runtime that supports specific features and sort of the use of those specific features inside the pod spec. So an example that's currently kind of in review is the user namespacing stuff. So not all runtimes support that, and the ones that do may have it on or off. And so would a pod that wanted to make use of that need to reference a runtime class that indicated support for it, and then also opt in to that feature or configure that feature in the pod spec? It seems like double opt-in.
So I don't want to go too deep on this as it's not part of the initial proposal, and there will be a separate update to the CAP that goes much deeper into this topic, and we can have another review for that as well. The short answer is if you're planning on using user namespaces, probably you expect your default native container implementation to support that. And if you're running a cluster that doesn't have that support, then this will help you to get that error message earlier rather than just finding that your pods have silently ignored it, which happens today.
So how closely, I didn't read the CAF, I'm sorry, or not in a while. How closely is this adhering to the storage class model? Maybe I should clarify exactly the things I'm thinking about. Storage class, I think, had two interesting properties that I'm curious about here. One is the fact that it's a resource users can go shopping for it, but there's a default. And the default is configured by an admission controller, which looks at all of the existing classes and decides which one is the default based on some heuristic. And the other is that the classes are effectively site defined. There's no standard across classes of what they're named or what they mean. We don't necessarily want the class to be named Docker. You want it to be named containers or C groups or something that means something to your particular site. And those two sort of bits of abstraction meant that most users don't actually have to deal with it at all. And only those users who specifically have some need to choose a different than default runtime can do so, and the administrators are in full control of what those classes mean.
Yeah, so there's, let's see, there's a couple of things there. One, we are explicitly decoupling the notion of conformant runtime classes from this proposal, because that's a whole nother can of worms to unpack. I eventually would like to see some sort of, whether or not they are really well-defined conformant classes or sort of semantically meaningful classes, have some like kind of predefined runtime class names that you can have some expectations for.
Otherwise, you need a runtime class to map between the set of properties that you expected and which class represented that. We're running into this in conformance as well for storage, for instance, which is if we're going to have a conformance profile say, well, your cluster must have dynamic provisioning of volumes with a particular set of portable behaviors, there needs to be a way to configure that is going to be portable across environments without configuring it in the test.
But there's the default. So if you assume that the performance is always based on the defaults.
Right, so that works for one.
Yeah.
If we get into a situation where there's a standard conformance container runtime and a standard sandboxed container runtime, then the one default doesn't work anymore.
So does it mean that there will be standard?
Probably won't get heard.
Yeah.
I was just asking if does it actually mean that we'll be having standard set of features published for each and every runtime that we think is going to be supported by upstream? Because like that then goes into the overall application API surface, right? Like across kernel, across the across storage, and like it's a large surface area, and like so how confident are we in capturing that to our APIs?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting at with like it could be conformant defined by conformance test and say these are the features that must be implemented by the native runtime class, and these are the ones that are optional, and these are the ones that must be forbidden or not used or something.
Right. Effectively, we'll have that once we add the portable pod functionality to the conformance suite.
Or it could be more of a semantic description of like, these are the expectations for this runtime class. For instance, with a sandbox runtime class, I don't think we can realistically write a test that guarantees two security boundaries between the process and the host kernel. And so that's a place where we would have a semantic description and say, this is the expectation for a sandbox runtime.
But there's no conformance around that then?
Right.
It might have to be security review based or something instead of testing based.
Okay. So then it becomes the best of a thing, essentially.
So it becomes a self-certified thing.
Right.
Right.
But this notion of kind of runtime class names that are portable across environments is why this isn't just a runtime field on the pod. It's why we've kind of decoupled it, had this sort of like indirection of the pod refers to the runtime class. The runtime class spec, if we jump down to the API definition, includes a runtime handler, which is the actual thing that is interpreted by the CRI to run the runtime. So your runtime class might be sandboxed, and your runtime handler is gvisor, or something like that.
So from a typical ConOps of how you would actually use it in production, when I bring up the cluster, I would create a set of So a typical use case for a user would be like, I bring up a cluster and then I install a series of runtime classes to describe what the capabilities are of the different runtimes. And then how do I attach that to the individual nodes where the runtimes are supported? Or is that introduced at boot up time? And also, can you delete them and update them?
Again, we're kind of like listing out every single thing that's listed as stuff we want to do with this and like why this is a useful feature and a useful resource to have, but let's not tackle that now. So we eventually would like to have some sort of notion of discovery where nodes could say, these are the 3 runtimes I support, and the scheduler can kind of route pods to the desired nodes.
But is it safe to say that initially the assumption is every node supports every runtime?
Yes. So initially, the assumption is either you're running a homogeneous cluster or you're dealing with taints and tolerations and node selectors and whatnot to send your pod to the
much like you would with
place.
GPUs or something like that.
Exactly. And if the pod if the node tries to run a pod or goes to run a pod and finds that well, I guess if the node goes to run a pod and the runtime class doesn't exist, the pod will be rejected or failed. If the container runtime goes to run the pod and says, I don't know what to do with the runtime handler foobar, then that will just return an error and ultimately
so I'm going to do a time check. We used half of the time for this discussion. I want to make sure that we have time to discuss some of the actual project logistics, like how to build the API, whether we can add a field to pod, whether to use a feature branch, what is the time frame for this, and stuff like that. So where is the implementation? What's the current implementation status?
We would like to get this into 1.12 as an alpha feature behind a feature gate.
But do we have runtimes ready to use it?
Yes. So there's where is that? So Cryo, Containerd, and Fracd, and Windows all have an annotation that they use, and they're all different. Or deciding whether pod should be run in
why does Cryo was one of the ones in your list?
Yeah.
What sandboxing mechanism does it have?
There's a Cryo trusted sandbox annotation on the pod that determines whether to use the trusted or untrusted runtime.
Okay.
So the goal is to deprecate all those annotations and that things should be using runtime class instead. But support ultimately, we'll add this as a field to the CRI, and it will be up to the individual runtimes to actually add, do something with that field and add support for it.
Okay, so this would be alpha in the initial release that it appears, correct?
Yeah.
I did glance at the API PR. So as was hinted at earlier, and we're trying to move early development out of Kubernetes master.
Mm-hmm.
So alpha features generally are turned off by default, or at least we tried to make that true. We don't yet have a field gating mechanism as far as I'm aware. Jordan or Daniel?
There's that
correct?
drop default fields thing that happens in the API. Is that not?
Yeah, in the strategy, you depend on the feature gate and you strip out the field as it goes through a prepare for create step.
But does it get elided from API discovery, for example? Is it in the open API schemas?
It's still in the schema.
It's still in the schema, yeah.
Yeah. So this is where we tell people not to use annotations, but we don't have field gates yet either. And you know, as we try to stabilize pod, I really don't want to add an alpha field that is present there. If we can help it, I also don't want to add any more compiled in types. If we can help it, and since this isn't going to be a high churn API type, there's no strong technical justification for why it has to be compiled in, like it doesn't need proto or some of those other things. So the question is, you know, how much work do we push on to some efforts, be it this one or some other one, to actually push that stuff over the finish line?
Yeah, we can talk about what we should not do so that we can cause this to happen.
Yes. So yeah, I would say, you know, for the people who want to try this out, could they build a development build of Kubernetes? Like, who's chomping at the bit to actually get this and try it out and get feedback on whether it works or not for those runtimes? Like, I don't know who's using Bracty or trusted runtimes, or who's waiting for that. Does it actually need to be in an official release even disabled?
I mean, the Kata containers and gvisor communities are both pushing to, you know, deliver this feature. Kata containers went to 1.0 a couple months ago, and so they're kind of looking to get customers using this with Kubernetes. That said, I think it's important that we get some like basic functionality in so that the runtimes themselves, Containerd and Cryo in particular, can start to actually implement the functionality that we need from them.
And beyond that, actually, the Windows community also push on this feature. Even the initial card, we explicitly say that's not in the scope, but we also say that we on purpose extended that data for Windows support and other feature support. So the both want to this kind of get experience. We have the Runtime Class API in, and then you could align with the pod, have the specific of the runtime requirement. So how this can go forward?
Yeah, I mean, the choices we have, none of them are great, but it's basically a fork or extensions, right? Like if there's a community of people who want to get together and prove something out, those are the two main options.
Could you do this with just an extension? Like, doesn't it implicitly require a fork because of the modifications to pod necessary to get it work?
And kubelet.
And kubelet, and then I was kind of thinking scheduler should, you're just going to use taints and tolerations to force the pod initially.
Yeah, I don't think the scheduler needs any changes right now.
This is a pattern that we see every day of the week. In, you know, somebody wants to do some new idea, and in order to get there, it has to have some root in an existing object. Right? We saw the same thing with snapshots, and you know, all they need is one tiny little field, and then they'll be happy. And like, we can totally push you to CRD, and I think that would be reasonable.
Well, there's still the pod field, which the only other
there's
alternative.
this one little field that you need as a root in your other object, right? Unless we design some other way to do this in a more extensible way, right? In the past, we said, we'll do it as an annotation. That way it's not official. And we know that there's a lot of pain down that road. And then we said, well, don't do annotations, do alpha fields. And we know that there's a lot of pain down that road. Do we have another alternative that we can tell people? I mean, to draw comparisons, what does the Linux kernel community do when they have a new thing that they want to add? They ship patches around and tell each other to build a new kernel and try your user space against this kernel. And then when you're all happy, then the patches get merged. Does that apply here? Like
Right, that would be like a feature branch.
Our ecosystem is different, right? Like our user base is different. It's not primarily developers. The feedback we want here is more end user. I'm not sure that go build your own branch is appropriate. I'm very open to hearing new ideas about how to make these sorts of growth avenues.
Yeah, and the other alternative is we turn annotations. We solve the problems that annotations had, and say use annotations again, instead of fields.
I mean, using annotations only for alphas. Is
that Jordan snickering?
Yeah, I hear Jordan.
No, annotations are actually okay for things that you don't intend to become fields eventually. So as a way to hang information on things, that's actually okay. It's the things that may eventually be promoted that gets really problematic.
I mean, is it really problematic for alphas? If we just limit alphas?
we have to break compatibility.
Yes, but we know exactly how we break it in this case and where you break it to. So maybe it's not that bad. And for the scope of the feature, you're really talking about modifying kubelet more than anything else, right? I mean,
yeah, there are many features that end up wanting to modify the kubelet, and like because of transitive dependencies, they end up having to become core features or like needing change for objects. You don't have a you'll have to add lots of extensions to lots of modules.
I think a lot of people complain about the Kubernetes conform test is not coverage is not enough. The reason it is one of the reasons, there are many reasons. One of the reasons it is a lot of things bypass out the API and goes to Kubernetes, the Kubernetes directly, and the Kubernetes derives from a lot of features, and the Kubernetes itself don't have an API to be conformed here. And so, for example, Kubernetes have a lot of core features, and the eviction management, for example, is the core feature, but there's no good way to conform of the eviction management, to conform of the quality of the services. So a lot of feature actually we've been proposed to the community, say, oh, I want the feature. When you saw that one, you say it's not compatible with existing Kubernetes development, but definitely conform with today's API. Because a lot of feature and is on the Kubernetes side, it's not in the API.
More behavioral rather than semantic.
Yes.
But so to this point of how do we take a completely experimental feature and link it into the tree of our existing resources in a way that is.
If we want to add a field, I think we should say we have to implement the flag gating mechanism.
Oh, you mean specifically for the open API stuff? I mean, that's the biggest issue, right? Because we have the field gates.
Well, and for documentation and for other things.
Everything that's generated from
everything that's generated, we need to convey everywhere that it's alpha and be able to gate it on and off based on whether alpha features are enabled. Like it should not show up in your open API spec if alpha features are disabled.
Do you expect the same for beta features?
Eventually, yes. Within a year, I expect the same for beta. Like we have people who really need stability, that they don't want upgrades to break them. They want to disable alpha and beta features so they don't get in trouble with their users. Like the operator may not control all the people who are deploying stuff to the cluster, right? So we are getting demand for that. I think the biggest hold up is L7 load balancing, the lack of a stable API there. But once we add a stable API there, like beta is going to be the new alpha for a lot of people, I think. And we're going to need this mechanism. On the API side, I'm going to say definitely cannot be a compiled-in API. Like we need to try to use a CRD for it. Like there is no technical justification, especially at the alpha stage, for using a compiled-in API. The field is more questionable, but I would like to push really hard on seeing how hard the field gating is. I'm not saying API machinery necessarily has to be the one implementing it. Obviously, they have to review it.
The API still needs to be compiled into the kubelet, though, right?
Not necessarily.
Be feature gated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the behavior can be feature gated.
And it can use. Go ahead, Jordan.
You can use a dynamic client, especially if it's basically looking up a single object and pulling a single field out of it. It can do that without needing compile types. If it's small and low traffic and a very simple object to get information out of, it can do that with completely unstructured requests if we wanted it to.
It would be good to find out what would break if that's not actually true. And we're trying to move more in the direction of, and I wish we didn't call it custom resource, more like dynamic resources as opposed to compiled in types. It has a lot of potential benefits for rolling out new features. I mean, not for you, you can change it dynamically, like within a release, and roll it out even to live clusters and things like that, and see changes immediately. Or you can roll back changes if something breaks.
So like so many of these proposals, I don't think there's much debate among the SIG Arch crew that CRD or just RD is the right way to be adding new resources. There are some issues with it. Jan raised a few this morning, like who registers the CRD and what happens if it's not there and those sorts of things that I think we need to answer. But you're now the third or fourth.
Saad asked the same questions, and we told him the controller should do it.
Okay, so we need to come up with a good, solid demonstration of this, like the canonical example, and you're in good company because there's at least a half dozen other people who are in the same boat. But we do still have to figure out whether we're going to add fields and flag gates, or whether we go back to annotations for alphas, or whether we come up with some other way of doing things.
Yeah, and the biggest problem with annotations, and we can address things like dropping the field if it's not supposed to be present, dropping the annotation if it's not supposed to be present, and stuff like that. But you can't represent the same thing two different ways in the same version of the API. That there's just no mechanical way to make that work with all clients and scenarios. You basically have to do it in different API versions. The client has to be able to request which version it expects. Like, does it expect the annotation or does it expect the field? So we need a new versioning mechanism if we're not going to just start cranking out new API versions on a more regular basis, like V1, V1.1, V1.2, V1.3. That's the only means we have of doing that right now.
We're at time, so we should probably, are there decisions on this or anything that we need to take action on before the next meeting? And if so, we should move those to the mailing list.
Yeah, I think the action item is we need to figure out how hard flag gating is going to be, like actually implementing even a half-baked version of that.
Field gating, right.
Field gating, sorry, yeah. Field gating. And start working on the logistics of runtime classes CRD.
Can we have a deadline for the figure out how hard the field gating? Basically, there are many features. This is just one of the features, and also storage have the 2 feature list. It's kind of like the block by this one. So can we have the deadline figure out? And if we couldn't figure out, give us some like expectation, so then we know what we should plan.
Yeah, we should definitely have that in the mailing list, and we can follow up on the mailing list discussion in the next meeting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that would be good.
Next meeting being 1 week?
Correct.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for your participation, and thanks to all the people who presented their things today, and I'll see you in a week, and have a great rest of your day.
Sorry, one last thing.
Sure.
It'd be worthwhile to get Saad and Jan and Tim and everybody else who's working on official resources as CRDs into a room to talk about the mechanics of how to register and the semantics and all those things.
Yeah, that would be good.
I can help you with. We did this with the app resource. I can tell you what's going to break.
Excellent. I nominate Ken as the leader.
Yeah, it's not bad. Like installing it is not your problem.
I'm not concerned that it's bad. I'm just concerned that people will do it differently if we don't write it down.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We're done.
Thanks.